I have this one buyer. He'll probably know if we do publish this, he'll probably know who I'm talking about if he listens to this.
Shout out.
Shout out. Yeah. Because he drags his feet all the time on, pursuing practices, and he's already missed out on two.
Wait,
And
if I'm going to be Eric today, then I'm going to say what Eric says, which is what?
get
Time
up
kills all deals.
deals. Yeah. And also, what is it? Either
Oh, no, that's what I say. And I don't know if we can say that on here.
go ahead. We said something else before say it.
I don't want to say
Either either
the Texas. Okay. As the Texan on the call, I'm going to say what we're going to say in Texas, and that is bleep me, Josh. Get off the pot.
yeah.
Pull the trigger.
If you want it, get it, because there's a lot of
Yes.
people looking right now, and it's
Right.
like get yourself in gear to get the information you need in order to pull the trigger. That's right.
Right. Do not assume that you are the only person looking, because that's a good way to miss out on your opportunity.
Welcome to Getting Down to Business, the show about helping you run a successful dental practice every step of the way. In today's episode, we examine the process of determining the economic value of a business, also known as a valuation. Joining us on today's show is our valuation specialist, Rachel Robles. Rachel has been performing valuations for several years now and has helped many practice owners determine the worth of their business in a fair and competitive market. As Rachel will concur, determining the value of a business involves assessing various factors, including the company's revenue, expenses, earnings, market position, and future prospects. Adding to the discussion is our business broker consultant, Kelly Yardman. Kelly has a wealth of experience in facilitating the sale of a practice once the valuation has been completed and is on the market. We're excited to share this episode with you and hope that it will provide a framework for how we value a dental practice. Now, let's get down to business.
I'm going to just go ahead and start off with a little bit of a question for you guys. Have you guys heard of King Solomon before?
Mhm.
Okay. So he wrote a book in the Bible called Ecclesiastes. And in the book, there's this long discourse about there's a time for everything. There's a time to plant and a time to reap, and there's a time to live and a time to die, and there's all of these different times and seasons. And that was
Isn't there a
actually what,
song?
yeah, there is actually a song. It's an old, I think it's like a 60s song or a 70s song. Norton Hindley wrote about that in the beginning of the chapter about valuations. And so there's obviously a time to buy and there's a time to sell. That's just what I wanted to kind of set the theme as is, obviously people get valuations at different stages in their career. Either buyers are getting them because they want to know what a practice is actually worth, and sellers are getting them because they want to know what they can actually sell them for, even though they'll probably
Mhm.
ask for more. That's kind of my first question for Rachel. Is can you give me an example of, when do people typically get valuations? And do they tend to get them at the right time? Is there a right time to get a valuation? There's a time for everything, right? So when's the best time to get a valuation?
The best time would be not when you're pressed to sell. I mean, there may be emergency situations where you need a valuation because you need to sell immediately, and that does happen, probably more often than people realize. But uh, getting a valuation before you're absolutely ready to sell, I've already got one foot out the door, um, hinders your ability to make any material changes. Because our evaluations are based on historical information. And if you get your valuation at the time that you're ready to sell, it's based on, historical before today. However, if you give yourself an opportunity to have some time between your valuation and your sale, then you get to make possibly and hopefully material changes to improve your value between the time that we value it and you're actually ready to sell. That can be improving your top line, improving your expenses, but it can make some significant changes in your value.
So it sounds like, to me anyways, like if I was a dentist and like I'd been working for, decades, I would imagine that there would be sort of a point when my practice would reach a peak and I would probably be generating the most amount of, revenue. I'd be doing the best that I could possibly do. And I kind of want to sell my business before things start to decline. It sounds like it's better to not put that off to the last minute. It's better to kind of get the valuation when things are moving along, because that's going to help me sell my practice, hopefully at a higher rate than if I were just putting things off until the last minute. When things are good, all of the return to labor, the return to capital, those things are all healthy and robust.
Well, if you wait until you've already kind of started to slow down, you've already decided I don't want to work 4 days a week anymore, or I don't want to work all day, or, I don't want to maintain this schedule, and you've already kind of let off a little bit on the gas, then, like I said, our valuation is based on, historical financials, and your business based on that historical data has started to decline already. So we're taking that into account. So if you want maximum value, then you don't want to let it decline before your sale.
That makes perfect sense. And there's another question I want to ask you, and I don't mean to stump you on this. So if you're not sure, we can always, take this out. But are valuations ever given for litigation purposes?
Yes.
Can you talk about that briefly?
Well, and this I won't be able to talk to. I haven't experienced a situation yet where I'm involved in a valuation for purposes like that, but it can be because of a divorce. It can be because of a business situation that went sour.
Like a partner is buying from another partner or buying someone out. And they're going to court for that. I wanted to add something to your timing, your little timing thing. And I don't know if either one of you are fans of Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yes, you can exclude this part, but I have fallen asleep every night for the last week to the Seinfeld show.
So do I.
I
So do
love it.
I. We have it on after the news and we go to sleep with it. So when he was interviewed about why he ended the show, one of the things that he said is, for me, this is all about timing. My life is all about timing. As a comedian, my sense of timing is everything. I wanted to end the show on the same kind of peak we've been doing it on for years. I wanted the end to be from a point of strength. I wanted the end to be graceful. And I think that is a huge part of why people should get valuations before they want to sell. They want to be able to end on a high note.
Well, and with some control, right?
Yeah, not because they have to. Like you said, not because they're forced into it because of a health situation or because they're just tired of doing it. I have a dentist right now that's in that situation. He has had many health situations that have prevented him from really being able to work as effectively as he was doing before. And he can't sell because his practice is not valued what he needs in order to retire. So he's forced to continue working even though his health is not so great.
Sounds like there's a whole, I mean, I might be generalizing here, but let me ask you, do you think that there's a lot of docs out there that are sort of in the dark about these kind of things, and then they don't really have anybody advising them on these types of decisions that could, if they had been advised, if they had the knowledge, they could have said, like this doc, for example, if he had somebody, and obviously you have to listen, but if he had somebody, giving him good counsel on looking at the future and getting things, valued early on. And it sounds like, there's a lot of docs that need help with these complicated, transition strategies and how to get the ball started, getting the ball rolling.
I would guess that most of them are in the dark.
Oh, that much?
Not
Okay.
not some. I would guess that most of them are in the dark because it's not something that you worry yourself with until it's time. And unfortunately, that's too late to make a difference.
How do you arrive at a fair price when you do a devaluation? What's the process that you take into it? What's the process to arrive at the number that I know that this is a complicated question, but it's an important question. We need to know, how do you arrive at a fair price? How is that determined?
And I'm going to skip to the end of the valuation process. We go through many, many, many steps to get to what we feel is an appropriate range of value, but how we settle on what we think is a fair price includes a reasonability test where we measure the free cash flow. And that free cash flow has to be, in an adequate range where the buyer would be able to qualify to the best of our ability. The buyer would qualify for funding. The bank wouldn't have any issue lending based on our calculation of free cash flow. And if our calculated value does not meet that reasonability test, then it's not a fair price.
Is there often a disparity in terms of practice value? Meaning that, let's just say I'm the doctor. I'm ready to retire. I have asked you to perform a evaluation. You've come back and you've told me my practice is only worth 750,000. I thought it was 1.5 million. There's a disparity there. Is that something that you see often where the people that you're performing the evaluation for are maybe a little bit let down or even shocked that what they thought was worth a lot more is actually worth a lot less?
Unfortunately, that happens a lot where the seller is, I don't want to say let down or unpleasantly surprised, but where our value comes in lower than their expectation. That does happen relatively often. That can be from multiple factors where, our valuation takes into consideration multiple methods, and a lot of people will estimate their practice's value based on just the revenue that they're generating. And our multiple valuation methods can significantly differ than, from a calculation of just a percentage of revenue. So if someone had a big practice, they generate over $1 million and they just assume that their practice is worth a certain percentage of revenue, our opinion can be significantly different than that based on their practice's actual earnings. And as we talked about before, if they have been a little bit lax on things like expenses or let their top line revenue kind of slack a little bit because of their schedule or something, then our opinion of fair market value and their personal opinion of their practice's value could be significantly different.
Do you also take into account the condition of like the machinery within the office? If it's old and outdated, does that affect the valuation?
Yes, it does. It may also affect their ability to market their practice and be as enticing, because someone buying in likely, it's the same idea as listing your house. Is it a fixer upper or has it been recently renovated? You're going to get a lot more attention potentially with a move-in ready home versus one that not everybody wants to take on a fixer upper. So is your practice move-in ready? Or is your practice a fixer-upper?
And if it's a fixer-upper, you have to take into consideration that a lot of dentists, because they want the move-in ready, if they do consider purchasing the fixer-upper, they're going to have additional debt to make that practice into a practice that they want.
Are there ever scenarios where we talked about this for a different business? There were certain liabilities in this example. It was gift cards that a business had not included. They weren't keeping track of them. So the people that were, they had all these gift cards that they'd sold to customers that hadn't been, realized yet. So it was, it wasn't really something that you guys could just look over and be like, oh, well, you've got all these, all this cash out there that hasn't been brought into the business through gift cards. That's a liability. Are there ever situations in where there's like liabilities that are kind of out there? Maybe patients have paid for certain services in advance or anything like that. Does that ever come into play?
I think it does. I haven't had a practice that I had significant, like a dental practice where they had.
Like Rachel, if you have like payment plans, like prepaids, like when we did the one
It would
that we
be
did recently.
right. It would be like, for example, an orthodontic office where they paid in advance for services that they will receive over the next 6 months or something like that.
Or even a practice that does Invisalign. So Invisalign is similar to orthodontics.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be a general practice that does Invisalign. So they have like that prepaid aspect of their revenue that comes in, similar to orthodontic or orthodontics.
But Kelly, tell me if I'm right in also the dental industry's situations where you may have some outstanding liability could be where the selling doc sets up their agreement of finishing treatment or doing retreatment. That's part of their purchase agreement.
Yeah, so those are paid to the selling doctor already. So when we do the purchase agreement, we always add in the treatment that the selling doc has to finish. And then also we have to consider retreatments because there are some types of things that fail in dentistry, and a lot of doctors will provide a warranty on those things. And so a patient will, maybe something happened to their crown or it broke, or they have a crack or something happened, and they come in and it's the new dentist now. And so there's something in the purchase agreement that always goes over that, of what happens when something like that happens, who takes over the care. And a lot of times it's the buyer that takes over the care, and the seller has to reimburse the buyer because the seller has already been paid on that treatment and for those devices. And so, the seller has to basically give, some kind of compensation to the buyer because they provided the retreatment of the service that the seller guaranteed. But we always put a time limit on that. We don't think like after 3 years that someone should be coming in with a failure of a device. That's usually a patient caused failure, not the device or the doctor that did that. That's a long time to go before having a failure. So we do have things in place in the purchase agreement to where people, can get the treatment they need in a time frame that they need it, but there's always something that has to be worked around between the buyer and the seller regarding payment of who gets paid on that.
I think that's a typical example of a liability.
Yep.
Wow, there's a lot that goes into acquiring all this information. There's a lot of different moving pieces, a lot of things to take into account for. So all that to say, who is really qualified to give a valuation?
Who is qualified to perform evaluation?
Like what are the if I was, shopping around to get a valuation, why would I choose Hindley Burgmaier Group?
Well, for Eric has a lot of experience. And I don't know other firms what their credentials are or what are all the methods that they use. I can speak for ours. We use many methods, multiple methods. We use a lot of information, a lot of background information. We learn as much as we possibly can about the practice or the business that we're selling. I don't have a credential yet, but that's my 2024 resolution. But Eric does have a certified valuation analyst credential. So he went through NACVA where he, has his CPA. And so he went that route in order to get his CVA. I'm not a CPA. I don't have a financial education. I have a science education. So I'm going to go through ASA, American Society of Appraisers, and get my accredited member credential, where it's not exactly the same because it doesn't come from the same credentialing body, but it's the same information. And so basically we back up our opinion with educational proof.
Well, and also, Josh, I mean, that's a very interesting question. Like, why would somebody come to us? Because there's other, companies that offer valuation services. And we have reevaluated some valuations that have come to us through due diligence processes. And then in those types of scenarios, sometimes we come up with the same value. And so somebody could argue, well, if you're coming up with the same value as this other company who offered this valuation for free, why should I go through you? I think, from my point of view and from doing this for many years now, I'm not an evaluator. I do facilitate the practice acquisition phase of the sale. And I've worked with Eric for many, many years, since almost day one of him having his own business, as a CPA, that our value we can defend in a court of law. Now, that means that, for instance, if I'm a buyer and I go in to buy a practice from Hindley Burgmaier Group, and I know that they did the valuation on the practice, and I paid $1 million for that practice based on their valuation, and I go in there and about 3 months in, I'm not reaping the same benefit the previous owner did. Like, I'm not doing the same. So I get in my head that it's not me, it's the seller. They gave me the wrong information. The valuation was wrong. This is not valued what I thought it was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get angry, and I'm going to go after that seller, and I'm going to go after the Hindley Burgmaier Group because I think the valuation is incorrect. Well, we can defend that valuation in court, and pretty much most times a court of law is going to see that our valuation is correct, that a buyer could be going in there and not doing the same things that the seller did, and that's why they're not reaping the same benefit, and that's the reason why they're not making the same amount of money, not because the valuation is incorrect. Also, we give sometimes we give ranges, sometimes we give like a fixed amount, that what we think that the practice is worth. And some people will go to banks and say, I want to know what the value is with the bank, and the bank is going to give a big range of value too. But they're giving their value based on their own metrics that they go by. And they want to lend the most amount of money on the business. So they will value the business at the most that they will lend on the business. So that's not really saying that's what the value is, that the bank is telling you what they'll lend on it. And so they also ask us for what we think the value is, because then they base what they'll lend on it based on that as well. They always want to know, how did you come up with that price? I'm not saying everybody should come to us, even though I would really love it, but I think getting a professional valuation done by a CVA is very important, or an ASA is very, very important, to make sure that you know what the value is of your business or practice.
Speaking of value, the term fair market value is obviously a very important term, and it's to me at least, it's the number that you arrive at when you finish your valuation. I guess without getting too much in the weeds here, we'll just keep it simple. You know, what is fair market value? What does it suggest to the buyer?
In the simplest terms, a fair market value is the value at which a property would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither of which, as Eric would say, have a gun to their head. Neither of which are motivated or are under any significant compulsion to buy or sell immediately, and their dollar value is not motivated in that way. And then both buyer and seller have full access to all information about the business that is going to change hands. So as you mentioned, the situation we talked about earlier, I mean, that doctor hasn't sold yet, but he may at some point be willing to let his practice go at even a lower value than what we end up valuing at, because he is motivated, as in he just can't go to work anymore. You know, so for example, if our fair market value was $1 million, he may be willing to accept 75% of that in order to get out faster, right? So his actual sale price would be lower than our opinion of fair market value because he was under compulsion to sell. Does that make sense? Or if someone overpays, arguably, right, based on our unmotivated, unbiased opinion of value, they may be more motivated to purchase something and overpay for it because it's just exactly what they wanted. You know, I'm going to buy.
Right location.
Right. It's worth more to them to pay a little bit more to get exactly what they want. That would be, you know, an example of motivation where they pay more than our unbiased opinion of the fair market value.
Awesome. Yeah. How do you take into account, I guess you'd call it like customer loyalty? Like, is there ever a risk if somebody gets a valuation, you're looking at certain trends of revenue in and expenses and all that stuff and patient flow? Is there ever a risk where, like, when the main doctor retires or sells the practice, how do you know that the patients are going to stick there? Is there anything that you guys kind of look at as far as how do we know that once this practice is sold, that the customers will keep showing up? Does that ever come into play?
Yes, and I'll give a few examples, and then I'm sure Kelly will also have examples on how to answer this question. There are lots of things that go into it. During our valuation process, we look at many risk factors. For example, how long has the business been in the same location? How long has the business been open? Well, they've been open for 27 years, 13 of which have been in exactly the same location. Those are great things. If the business has been purchased in the last 3 years, and in that 3 years they moved locations, those would be considered a little bit more risky, right? Because your patients have recently undergone, some change. So we would consider that in our overall risk assessment. Also, we advise new buyers not to make changes in the first year. That means, you do your best to offer the same services. You don't make changes to your staff, meaning offer the same benefits, even, because when you go in to see the dentist, you also see your hygienist. You also see the same front office girl. You're used to the same services, and as many things as that office can stay the same, especially during the transition period. If the patient comes in and the only thing that's different is the dentist, but they still do a great job, the likelihood that they're going to leave and go find another office and have to get to know somebody else is unlikely. As long as they have a great experience, they're going to stay.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, Rachel, I mean, when I go to the dentist, I have gone, like last year I had a treatment plan, and I literally saw the dentist, and I have gone in the last, I want to say 12 months, I have gone to the dentist for my treatment plan probably 5 times. And in that 5 times, I've seen the hygienist more than the dentist.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want your patients to stay, they really have the relationship with the hygienist, not really the dentist. The hygienist is the one that stays with you the whole hour, working on your teeth, talking to you about her family. You're talking to her about your family if you can get a word out. The dentist comes in afterwards just to check to make sure everything's okay. And that's only sometimes. That's only if there's a reason to do that. So if you're buying a practice, the best thing to do is to make sure your staff is happy. That's how you're going to retain your patients. You want to make sure that there are absolutely no changes in how you handle your staff, so that they are happy to move to the new dentist, and they won't leave, and they will provide the same amount of great service that they're doing with the patients.
This might seem like a very obvious question, but why do sellers often want more than buyers are willing to pay?
Because if they're of retirement age, then they feel like they're going to have to live off of that.
Yeah.
And because they are emotionally attached and invested in the business that they may have had for the last 30 or 35 years or something like that, so it's not just a business to them, it's their life's work, so they're emotionally attached to it. So they're going to want more than maybe what other people see value in.
Yep. Great. Okay, so we talked about what fair market value is, and I guess we touched on how you determine the fair market value. I guess, is there anything else on that subject of fair market value that we skipped over, or is there anything else that we want to add about fair market value, how we determine it, or?
I would just point out that our opinion of fair market value may not be the ask price, right? We talked about fair market value being unmotivated and unbiased. A listing price or an asking price is not necessarily in line with fair market value, because an ask price can totally be based on motivation, right? If it's someone that needs to sell tomorrow, they may be listing their practice at 70% of the fair market value because they want to get out tomorrow. And if it is someone that's not really motivated to sell and they think they can get more than it's worth, then why not list it for higher? And then that comes, the art of negotiation.
I would imagine it's pretty rare, unless, like you said, time constraint, that they list under the fair market value.
In the 2.5 years or so that I've been helping Eric, I can think of 2 for sure valuations that I've done where the person that I was valuing for knew that they were going to ask for less. They were very motivated. But typically that's not my area. I do the valuation and then I'm pretty much done. So Kelly would be able to speak more to trends.
Yeah, so most people, once Cheryl and Eric talk to them about what the value is, most of the time they will list what they will ask for it, and then they won't budge. So once the value is established and they say, okay, we're willing to list at that price, that'll be the price point. Someone comes in, they look at the practice, they're like, the seller's like, no, I'm not, I'm gonna go with this price. I'm gonna keep on until somebody comes along and offers me this amount, because the seller knows that we valued it based on all of these methods that Rachel and Eric have, put together, and they know that that's the value and they're not willing to go any less. Now, Rachel had said just now that she's seen twice where they have asked, for less, or that they've went ahead and said it was okay to buy for less. But I've seen other people, there have been other times where people wanted more. I had a situation, which is like funny. It's just a funny situation where we valued a practice and the bank wouldn't finance the buyer for the whole amount because the buyer didn't have liquidity, meaning the buyer had a lot of debt and not a lot of assets, not a lot of, she needed to pay off some things. And so they wanted to do only lend a certain amount towards the practice. And then they wanted the seller to have to carry back a loan. Seller didn't want to do that. She did not want to be the bank. She did not want to take on any responsibility of having a loan, in addition to what the bank would pay for the practice. But she got it in her head that the bank thought that that was what the practice was worth.
Oh.
So in her head, she was thinking the bank's not lending on the total amount because my practice isn't worth that, which was not the case at all. It was just that the buyer couldn't buy at that price point.
The buyer couldn't qualify.
Right. And so they ended up, the deal ended up falling apart because of that, because, she thought that her practice wasn't worth that. And the buyer couldn't really buy the practice at any other, she needed her to carry some of the amount. So the deal ended up falling apart. Then we have another buyer that comes in and he wants to buy the practice and he's okay with the amount that we've established. However, when we do valuations, there's a lot of times when we have a listing that Rachel will update a valuation because the practice is doing better than it did before. So, like, let's just say it's been listed for 6 months. We did the valuation and then 6 months later, Rachel will update it. And in some cases, when she updates it, it's worth more. Now it's valued more. So now this valuation came in at more when this guy was, interested in purchasing it. Now the seller's like, well, I don't know about this guy. She's going back and forth on this guy. Great guy, known him for a long time. I think he would have been a great, buyer of this practice. So because she has her doubts or whatever, she decides that she'll lower the price for someone else. Because she's like, well, why don't you call that other girl that was going to buy the practice initially and tell her I'm willing to sell it for what she wanted to pay for it. And if she doesn't do it, then I'm going to up the price for him. I'm going to say, I'm not going to sell it to him for what we're saying it's worth. I'm going to up it. I'm going to ask for more money from him. So there's sometimes situations like that happen where, and in those situations, we ended up terminating the relationship with her because we didn't feel that it was appropriate for her to do that. She could lower the price, but she would need to lower it for everybody. She could up the price, but she would need to do that for everybody. We didn't feel like it was very appropriate for her to do that. And both of these people that were involved in as the buyers were people that we had relationships with. And so, you know, we do take very much into consideration, you know, those types of situations too. And there's times that we will walk away from an agreement with a doctor that may be unreasonable with how they price their practice.
Before we kind of wind things down, um, the process of performing the valuation, or the steps, if you will, can you break down, you know, or can you just talk about the steps that you take when you do perform, when you start, when you start to determine fair market value? What are some of the things you look at? The last few episodes have been on financial statements. The income statement, for example, is the income statement closely referenced when you perform your valuation? What are you looking at on the income statement? Do you kind of just start with the practice revenues, look at the expenses, try to figure out what their gross practice income is going to be, things like where do things like return to labor, as far as what the doctor is getting paid, factor into your valuation, things like that?
Yes, and yes. I'm going to try to give a brief overview of the valuation process. We take, to begin with, we like to use 5 years of information if it's available to us and if it's appropriate to use. And I'll just start this by saying, in every step of the process, there's an it depends, right? You have to decide each step of the process, is this applicable or not? So is it applicable to use 5 years of information? It depends. Is it good information? But I'll just try to give an example of like the most simple and perfect valuation. We would use 5 years of data. We would start with the tax return. It's a legal document. And then from the tax return, we're going to get more detailed information from the corresponding financial statements. The profit and loss statement, they show exactly what's on the tax return, but in a more detailed breakout. Then we'll look at trends. We'll ask questions to identify discretionary income and expenses so that we can get to what we would consider a normalized 12-month period. We use a weighted average. Oh, again, this is like the most perfect example. It doesn't always work out like this, but we like to use a weighted average of the 5-year period, meaning the most recent year has a more weighting. It has more impact on the average than, say, 5 years ago did. We have then the opportunity to omit years if we need to do that. For example, a lot of businesses that we value using the last 5 years have been significantly impacted by COVID. If we can justify that if we can justify that it's appropriate to remove the COVID year and not have it impact the valuation, then we will do that. And in a lot of cases, that is what we do. And that's like the first half of the valuation, is getting to a real good normalized 12-month picture of income and expenses that we would expect going forward. Then using that information, we apply our findings there to the different valuation methods. That's going to be asset approach, income approach, and market approach. And we'll decide what methods, that fall into those categories, what methods we're going to use based on the business that we're valuing. Sometimes it may not be appropriate to use certain methods. And then we will blend those methods to get to what we consider a fair market value. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, making sure that our value is reasonable against, our test of free cash flow. Did I answer all the questions? Oh, I missed one. You mentioned return to labor. We do consider in, cases like our dental practices, especially, return to labor is what you pay the owner doc, right? It's the owner operator. In a dental practice, the owner doc's income is discretionary. They can pay themselves way less than what a fair market value wage to them may be because they are the owner and they can choose to do that. In our evaluation, we represent the owner doc's income not as a discretionary number, but as a calculation of what any non-owner doc would be paid. And right now that's 30% of their production. In a general dental practice, most practices income or production is split 70% to doc, 30% to hygiene. So we use their practice reports to confirm that that's the case or make adjustments where necessary. And then we calculate return to labor. I know I'm talking fast. We calculate their return to labor to be 30% of what they produce and then use that as the doc's compensation to make sure that we are setting aside enough to cover the doc's salary. So we do take that, we do calculate return to labor a certain way, and then we do use that in our valuation to make sure that we have set aside adequate compensation.
The whole point of the valuation, as far as I'm understanding it, is, you want to get to the present value of the practice. And that's, that's something that changes every few years. It's probably a good idea if you're getting a valuation to update it. If you haven't sold in 5 years and you got your valuation 5 years ago, it's probably going to be a good idea to keep that current so that it reflects the present.
Right, and every business is changing, right? In the 5 years, we're going to see if, hopefully you're going to see a trend upward, right? You're going to see their revenue going up by a certain amount each year. And the longer you wait, you may start to see that decline a little bit, right? Because they let off on their schedule some. They just don't work as much as they did before. Maybe they don't offer all the same services that they did before. So there's going to be a difference in value, very likely, if you got a valuation 5 years ago and if you got a valuation today.
And to keep that, in mind when you, or if you have an associate. So if you are a dental owner and you have an associate working in your practice that wants to eventually buy your practice, it's great to have a valuation done now. And then you can see where your value is. Like, let's just say, for instance, you own a practice, you want to bring someone on board to work, to do an associate buy-in. And it'd be really good for you to get a valuation on your practice the way it is now, so that as the person starts producing in your practice, you have the double, you have you and you have them producing. The value is going to significantly change at the time that they're going to buy in. So they could, like, let's say they say that they're going to buy in within 5 years. So after a year, they buy in 10%, then they buy in 20%, then they go in 30%, all the way up to then they finally buy in 100%. You can establish what that buy-in amount would be if you get a valuation beforehand, so that you can see as you go through the process what that would be over a period of time. I'd get a value, like, some people are scared. They're like, oh, I don't want to get a valuation now because I don't know what I'm going to hear, or I don't know what it's going to be worth. What if it's a bad number? Well, that's great. You want to know if it's a bad number right now, because then you can make improvements to make the number be more acceptable for when you want to sell.
Right. I mean, it's never a fun conversation to have with someone that our opinion of their value is lower than what they were hoping for.
In their opinion, yeah.
The number that they've had in their head for however long. But I think it's great because it identifies for them their opportunity.
Mm-hmm. It's a big opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And in a lot of times, I can pinpoint several things that are bringing your value down. And in identifying those areas of opportunity, they now have the ability to hopefully make some significant changes that would give them better results at the time that they do want to sell.
So we also offer that to our clients that, come and say, we want a valuation done. We're not ready to sell. We just want to see what it's worth now and get some recommendations on how to improve. We will do that with clients.
Mm-hmm.
So if, doctor gets evaluation, they're like, wow, this isn't as much as I thought. But I'm not ready to retire. Maybe I need to look at either producing more or lowering expenses. Those are two drivers that will affect the valuation, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Well, guys, we're kind of approaching the hour. So before we wrap up, any other thoughts on valuations? This is a topic I'm sure we'll return to again at some point.
One of the things that I do want to point out too in the valuation or in the valuation process, and what we looked at when we looked at the cash flow statement and the profit and loss statement, and when you look at salaries of your staff and you look at it as an overhead expense, and if you're a doc coming in, or you're a doc that wants a valuation done, and you're looking at your expenses and maybe possibly saying, well, I have a little bit of time, I can improve my value. I think it's important to not really look at that salary expense for your employees as being something that you want to adjust, because that is something that's running your practice. Like your salaries, you really can't adjust the salaries unless somebody leaves and you hire somebody else at a lower rate. You can't really adjust salaries, and you want people to be there for a long time. You want to be able to say to a potential buyer that you have people that have been there for very long periods of time. But how you can improve is by increasing your top line. So you can create a better percentage in your salaries and wages, between those percentages that we talked about when we looked at the P&L and we looked at the salaries as a percentage of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
If we increase the top line, those percentages then adjust to lower. So those are things that need to be thought about when we look at improvement on a practice and how they can improve their percentages and ratios and stuff like that to get into a better selling position.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this episode educational and learned something new. If you're thinking about having a valuation or due diligence report performed for your business, or want more information about the Hindley Burgmaier Group, you can reach us at our office by calling 505-299-8383. Again, it's 505-299-8383. You can also schedule a meeting with Kelly Yardman by visiting our website, www.hindleyburgmeiergroup.com. Thank you for investing the time to listen to our show, and we hope you'll join us next time on Getting Down to Business.